Looking back, I suppose I should have seen where this was all heading, but honestly, I still think everyone else overreacted. Jackson always made everything about him anyway, so I guess it makes sense that he'd turned my personal growth into some kind of betrayal story. When we first got together 4 years ago, Jackson seemed like the perfect choice. He was a police officer, stable job, good benefits, the kind of guy who could provide real security. I was young, just 17, when we met, and he represented everything I thought I wanted: safety, loyalty, opportunity. He had his own place, a decent car, and he treated me like I was special. Back then, I thought that was enough. I thought I could build a life around being grateful for what he offered. Those first months were fine, I guess. Jackson would come home from his shifts and tell me about his day, making himself sound all important and heroic. He'd cook dinner sometimes, always wanting to play house like we were some perfect couple. I played along because why wouldn't I? He was giving me everything I needed: a place to stay, someone to take care of bills, someone who worshiped the ground I walked on. But even then, I could feel something missing. There was no excitement, no spark, just Jackson being predictable and safe and boring. The routine got old fast. Every morning, he'd make coffee, kiss my forehead, ask about my plans like he was my father or something. Every evening, he'd want to cuddle on the couch watching whatever stupid show he picked. Weekends meant grocery shopping together and maybe dinner at the same three restaurants he liked. I was 19 years old, for crying out loud. Was this really supposed to be the rest of my life? Then, 2 years ago, Jackson started getting into this new training program, some kind of combat sport thing that he thought would help with his police work. I wasn't particularly interested, but I figured I should be supportive. That's what girlfriends do, right? Show up, cheer him on, pretend like watching. Sweaty guys roll around on mats was fascinating. So I started going to his sessions, sitting on the sidelines with my phone, counting down the minutes until we could leave. That's when I met Anthony. God, the first time I saw him, I actually felt something I'd forgotten existed. He was everything Jackson wasn't: tall, lean muscle instead of Jackson's soft dad bod, confident in a way that didn't need a badge to prove itself. When he smiled at me during that first training session, actually smiled, like he was happy to see me there, I felt this little flutter in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. Jackson never looked at me like that anymore. To him, I was just part of the furniture. Anthony was new to the gym, maybe 6 months in when Jackson started, but everyone already respected him. He had this natural charisma that drew people in, made them want to be around him. And unlike Jackson, who only talked about work and complained about his supervisors, Anthony actually had interesting things to say. He traveled, had stories, made me laugh in ways that Jackson never could. I started paying more attention during training sessions instead of scrolling through my phone. I'd watch Anthony move, see how he interacted with everyone. He was kind to the newer guys, patient when they messed up, but fierce when he was competing. Jackson just looked clumsy and desperate next to him, trying too hard to prove he belonged there. After a few months, Anthony and I started talking more, nothing inappropriate, just friendly conversation. While Jackson was getting changed or talking to the coach, Anthony would ask about my day, actually listen to my answers, remember things I'd told him the week before. It was such a relief to talk to someone who treated me like an actual person instead of some prize he'd won. The more time I spent at that gym, the more I realized what I'd been missing. Jackson would grunt through his training, all serious and focused, while Anthony made everything look effortless. During breaks, Jackson would come over sweaty and exhausted, expecting praise for his mediocre performance, while Anthony would catch my eye from across the room and give me these little smiles that made my heart race. I started suggesting we go to training more often. Jackson was thrilled, thinking I was finally taking interest in his hobbies. Poor stupid Jackson. He had no idea I was going there for someone else entirely. I dress up for training sessions, do my hair, pick outfits that looked casual but showed off my best features. Jackson never noticed, but Anthony did. I could feel his eyes on me, could sense the attraction building between us. For almost a year, I kept going to those sessions, building this connection with Anthony while Jackson remained completely oblivious. We'd have these conversations that felt charged with possibility, these moments where our hands would brush when he helped me understand some technique Jackson was learning. It was innocent enough on the surface, but underneath, we both knew something was happening. Then Jackson lost his job. Some budget cuts at the department meant layoffs, and Jackson was one of the newer guys who got cut. Suddenly, my stable, secure boyfriend was unemployed, moping around the house all day, sending out resumes and complaining about how unfair everything was. Instead of handling it like a man, he turned into this needy, depressed version of himself who wanted constant reassurance that everything would be okay. But honestly, his unemployment was the best thing that could have happened to me. With Jackson home all day, feeling sorry for himself, I finally had the perfect excuse to get out of the house. I'm going to the gym, I'd tell him. I need to keep up the routine, even if you can't train right now. He was so wrapped up in his own problems that he didn't question why I was suddenly so dedicated to fitness. Those gym sessions with Anthony became the highlight of my entire week. Without Jackson there watching everything, we could actually talk free. Anthony would spot me during workouts, his hand steady on my back as I lifted weights, his voice encouraging in my ear. We'd grab smoothies afterwards, sitting close together at those little tables, talking about everything except the fact that I had a boyfriend at home. It felt so natural being with Anthony. He made me feel alive again, made me remember what it was like to be excited about seeing someone. When my phone buzzed with his texts, I'd get this rush of anticipation that I never felt when Jackson called. Anthony would send me funny memes, ask about my day, remember little details about things I cared about. Meanwhile, Jackson was at home in his pajamas, probably playing video games and feeling sorry for himself. The lunch date started. Innocently enough, Anthony would mention being hungry after our workouts, and I'd suggest we grab something to eat. Just two friends having a meal together, nothing wrong with that. But sitting across from him at those little cafes, watching him laugh at my jokes, seeing the way he looked at me like I was the most interesting person in the world. It was everything I'd been missing with Jackson. We started doing other things too. Anthony loved being outdoors, something never cared about. He'd suggest we go paddleboarding at the lake or drive out to watch the sunset from this spot he knew in the hills. These weren't dates, I told myself. They were just two people enjoying each other's company, sharing experiences that my boring boyfriend would never appreciate. I'd come home from these adventures feeling more alive than I had in years, only to find Jackson still sulking about his job situation. He'd ask where I'd been, and I'd give him vague answers about the gym or running errands. He trusted me completely, never questioned why I was suddenly so busy during his unemployment. If he'd been paying attention, maybe he would have noticed how happy I seemed, how much energy I had after my workouts. The texting between Anthony and me intensified. We'd message throughout the day, sharing thoughts and jokes and observations about everything. It felt so good to have someone who was actually interested in what I had to say, someone who responded with enthusiasm instead of Jackson's typical grunts and half-hearted replies. Anthony would send me pictures from his day, the view from his office, something funny he saw on the street, selfies that made my heart skip. So I started sending pictures back. I'd take photos when Jackson was in the shower or out at interviews, sending Anthony shots that showed off my best angles. Nothing too explicit at first, just cute selfies or pictures of outfits I was wearing. But when Anthony responded with fire emojis and told me how beautiful I looked, I felt this validation that I'd been craving for years. Jackson barely looked up from his phone when I walked through the room, but Anthony noticed everything. The photos got more intimate as time went on. I'd send Anthony the same pictures I sent Jackson just to see the difference in their reactions. Jackson would respond with a simple nice or maybe a heart emoji, while Anthony would write paragraphs about how stunning I was, how lucky he felt just to know me. The contrast was impossible to ignore. I was living two completely different lives, and honestly, I was good at it. Jackson was so absorbed in his job search and his depression that he didn't notice how often I was on my phone, how much happier I seemed, how I'd started putting more effort into my appearance. With Anthony, I felt like the best version of myself, With Jackson, I was just going through the motions. This went on for months. Jackson eventually found another job, but by then my connection with Anthony was too strong to give up. I'd gotten used to the excitement, the anticipation, the feeling of being truly wanted by someone. Going back to just Jackson felt impossible. I should have known Jackson would eventually figure something out. He was a cop after all, trained to notice when things didn't add up. But I'd gotten comfortable in my routine, confident that I was being careful enough. I wasn't expecting him to go through my phone, wasn't prepared for him to piece together all those gym sessions and lunch dates and afternoon adventures. The confrontation was ugly. Jackson sat me down with a serious expression like he was interrogating a suspect and started listing off everything he'd discovered. The private messages with Anthony, the photos we'd exchanged, all those times I'd said, I was running errands when I was really with him. Jackson's voice got higher and more emotional as he went through it all. Like he couldn't believe what he was reading. Secret gym sessions, Jade lunch dates. What the hell is this? He was waving my phone around like it was evidence in a murder trial. His face getting red and blotchy the way it did when he was really upset. And you sent him the same pictures you sent me. How could you do this to us? I tried to stay calm, tried to explain that he was overreacting. You're being insecure. I told him you're acting petty and you never let me have any friends, which was true. Jackson had always been jealous of other guys, always found reasons why I shouldn't hang out with people he didn't approve of. This was just more of the same controlling behavior, blown out of proportion because he'd found some text messages. But Jackson wasn't listening to reason. He was too caught up in his wounded pride, too focused on playing the victim. If you don't remove him from everything and stop seeing him, then we are done. He said like he was giving me some kind of ultimatum, like he had the right to tell me who I could and couldn't be friends with. That's when I knew for sure that Jackson and I were fundamentally incompatible. A secure, confident man wouldn't feel threatened by me having friendships. A mature partner would trust me to handle my own relationships without needing to control every aspect of my social life. But Jackson was showing his true colors. Possessive, jealous, controlling, everything Anthony had warned me about. Instead of backing down, I decided to show Jackson that I wasn't going to be controlled. I turned off my location sharing on my phone, stopped telling him every detail about where I was going and who I was seeing. If he wanted to act like a jealous boyfriend instead of a partner who trusted me, then he could deal with the consequences. I also stopped being as physically affectionate with Jackson. Why should I pretend everything was fine when he was trying to manipulate me into cutting off my friendship with Anthony? If Jackson wanted to make our relationship conditional on his approval of my friends, then maybe we didn't have the kind of relationship worth saving. Anthony was incredibly supportive during this difficult time. He could see how Jackson's controlling behavior was affecting me, how stressed I was from dealing with constant suspicion and accusation. You deserve better than this, Anthony would tell me during our conversations. You shouldn't have to live with someone who doesn't trust you. The more Jackson pushed, the more I realized Anthony was right. This wasn't about infidelity or betrayal. This was about Jackson's insecurity and his need to control me. A confident man would be happy that his girlfriend had good friends who cared about her, but Jackson saw Anthony as a threat, which said more about Jackson's own shortcomings than anything else. Things came to a head a few weeks later. Jackson had been giving me the silent treatment, acting like a martyr around the house, clearly expecting me to apologize and cut off my friendship with Anthony, but I wasn't going to let him manipulate me like that. I had every right to maintain my friendships. And if Jackson couldn't handle that, maybe we needed to reevaluate our entire relationship. So I decided to test whether Jackson was willing to be reasonable or if he was going to stick with his controlling demands. I told him I was going out with Anthony, that I'd be home later that evening. If Jackson truly trusted me and respected my autonomy, he'd be fine with me spending time with a friend. If he was the controlling, insecure person I was starting to think he was, he'd make it into a huge dramatic scene. Jackson's reaction told me everything I needed to know. Instead of wishing me a good time or asking me to say hello to Anthony for him, he got this look on his face like I just announced I was burning the house down, He didn't say much, just nodded with this tight expression, but I could feel his disapproval radiating across the room. Anthony and I had an amazing evening. We went to dinner at this new place he'd been wanting to try, walked around downtown, talked about everything and nothing. It felt so natural being with him. So, right, this was what a relationship should feel like: easy, comfortable, exciting, all at the same time, not the constant tension and walking on eggshells that I'd been dealing with at home. We ended up back at Anani's place just talking and listening to music. The conversation flowed so easily, and being close to him felt inevitable. When he kissed me, it wasn't some dramatic moment of betrayal. It was just two people who cared about each other, finally acknowledging what had been building between us for months. I knew I wouldn't be making it home that night. And honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to. Being with Anthony felt like coming alive after years of sleepwalking through my relationship with Jackson. This was what passion felt like, what real connection was supposed to be. I sent Jackson a text around 11:30, just a simple "we need to talk" message. I figured we could have a mature conversation the next day about where our relationship stood and what we both wanted moving forward. Maybe this would finally force us to address the real problems we'd been avoiding for years. But Jackson, predictably, couldn't handle an adult conversation about our relationship. Instead of meeting me halfway, he sent this dramatic message demanding I meet him at the park exactly at 7:00 p.m. and threatening to block me if I didn't show up right on time, like I was some kind of employee being called into the boss's office. When I pointed out that he'd originally said around 7 and was now being weirdly specific about the exact time, he acted like I was the one being unreasonable. This was classic Jackson making everything into a power struggle, trying to control even the basic logistics of about my conversation. Honestly, I was a little nervous about meeting him in person. Jackson had never been physically violent, but he was a police officer with a temper, and I'd never seen him this angry before. The smart thing seemed like handling this over the phone or through text, where things couldn't escalate into something dangerous. But Jackson was insisting on this dramatic face-to-face confrontation, and I didn't want to give him more ammunition to claim I was being unreasonable. The breakup conversation was as awful as I'd expected. Jackson was hurt and angry, which I understood, but he wasn't willing to take any responsibility for the problems in our relationship. In his mind, everything was my fault for cheating, and he couldn't see how his controlling behavior had pushed me away in the first place. I tried to explain that Anthony and I had connected as friends first, that the feelings developed naturally over time, that this wasn't some calculated betrayal. But Jackson wasn't interested in understanding my perspective. He just wanted to play the victim and make me into the villain. After 3.5 years together, I thought Jackson deserved an honest explanation of why our relationship had failed. But he was too emotional to have a rational conversation, too focused on his wounded pride to consider that maybe we'd simply grown apart. Within a few weeks, Anthony and I were officially together. It felt amazing to finally be open about our relationship, to not have to sneak around or hide our feelings. We started posting pictures together, going out in public, acting like a normal couple. After months of secrecy, the freedom was incredible. Of course, Jackson couldn't handle seeing us happy together. He'd apparently been telling people his version of events, painting himself as the innocent victim and me as some kind of heartless cheater. Some of our mutual friends bought into his narrative, at least initially, but the people who really knew us could see that Anthony and I were genuinely good together. Jackson even started spreading lies about our relationship, claiming he'd been abusive or had drinking problems. It was pathetic, really. Jackson barely drank at all, and he'd never laid a hand on me in 4 years, but I guess he needed to create some story that made him look like the hero instead of just a guy who couldn't keep his girlfriend interested. The community drama was exhausting, but Anthony and I focused on building our life together. Within a few months, we were talking about moving in together, making long-term plans. Everything was happening fast, but it felt right. When you know, you know. Anthony had to deal with some fallout from his friends and family, people who thought he should have stayed out of my relationship with Jackson. Some of the guys at the gym took Jackson's side, which was disappointing, but not surprising. Men always stick together, even when one of them is clearly in the wrong. But Anthony stood by me through all of it. Even when his family got involved, even when some of his friends turned their backs on him, he never wavered in his commitment to our relationship. That's how I knew what we had was real. He was willing to sacrifice other relationships to be with me. The pregnancy wasn't planned, but when it happened, we both knew it was meant to be. Here was proof that Anthony and I were building something real together, something that Jackson and I never could have achieved. Family, a future, a life built on. Genuine love instead of just convenience and security. Now I'm 20 years old, 12 weeks pregnant, and living with the man I should have been with all along. Anthony and I have moved in together, and despite what everyone says about the timeline being fast, we're happy. We're building the kind of relationship I always wanted, but never thought was possible. Yes, Anthony lost some friends over this situation. Yes, his family is still adjusting to our relationship, but that's what happens when you choose love over social expectations. The people who really matter will come around eventually, and the ones who don't probably weren't worth keeping anyway. Jackson, meanwhile, is apparently doing well, according to mutual friends. Good for him. I hope he finds someone who's better suited to his need for control and predictability, someone who's content with his boring routine and doesn't need the kind of excitement and passion that Anthony brings to my life. People love to judge situations they don't understand, to make assumptions about other people's relationships based on limited information. But I know what I experienced in those 4 years with Jackson, and I know how I feel with Anthony. The timeline might look dramatic from the outside, but when you've been unhappy for as long as I was, moving quickly toward happiness makes perfect sense. I'm not sorry for choosing my own happiness over Jackson's comfort. I'm not sorry for refusing to be controlled or manipulated into staying in a relationship that wasn't working. And I'm definitely not sorry for finding someone who loves me the way I deserve to be loved, even if the timing wasn't perfect. Anthony and I are planning our future together now, talking about marriage, about raising our child, about building the kind of life that Jackson never could have given me. It's everything I wanted, but didn't know how to ask for when I was younger and less sure of myself. The community can gossip all they want about how things ended between Jackson and me. They can count months and make assumptions and take sides, but at the end of the day, I'm the one who has to live with my choices, and I'm confident I made the right ones. Anthony and I are proof that sometimes you have to break a few rules to find real happiness.